strangle them to death in order to stop them from murdering people and consuming their flesh and becoming full-fledged Wendigos.
Oh, well, I mean, it solved that problem, I guess.
In case you didn't know, I'm Brian.
And I'm Matthew.
And this is Road Trip Recap.
Spoilers up ahead, because today we're going to be doing a recap of the Wendigo episode of Supernatural.
We're also going to be talking about what the Wendigo is and how Supernatural tackled it.
Let's hit the road. In the Wendigo episode, we start in Blackwater Ridge in Lost Creek, Colorado, which again is a fictional location where we see a couple of campers out doing their camping thing when they are attacked by an unknown creature at this time. From there, we shift over to theoretically Palo Alto, California, where we see Sam lying flowers on, his dead girlfriend's grave, and then she decides to attack, and turns out we were never actually there. It was just a dream.
It kind of pulls a Carrie.
Yeah. So Sam wakes up and he's in the Impala, and it's kind of like, where are we? And Dean references that they are just outside of Grand Junction. Now, just for a little bit of reference for those that are curious, we are literally just outside of Grand Junction right now. So slightly different view of the area. Not nearly as many trees as we saw in the episode, but
we're a high desert here.
you have to have got to give TV shows a little bit of liberties with some stuff. They can only do so much. So anyways, here we get another look at the latitude and longitude that was left to them by their father, which, again, looking up with just whole numbers, looking for just those coordinates, it would give you roughly an area of about 600 square miles to search. We get another look at the coordinates left to them by their father, and since they're just whole numbers, that would give us, again, about a 600 square mile area for them to search. So how they narrowed it down to Blackwater Ridge is beyond me.
A little bit of suspension of disbelief there, considering it's also supposed to be just outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. But
we get a couple more inaccuracies throughout the episode. Some of them are just to build the episode, and some I like to think of as how we get to see a growth from Sam and Dean. We always kind of see them as these knowledgeable hunters, but as you look back, you find a lot of errors or mistakes that they make that they then will kind of fix later on. Like, they're learning from their mistakes. It's almost like, thinking of it, they grew up watching their father do this. They went with him and they, probably helped and everything, but John was probably the one that was in charge of coming up with the fake IDs and, coming up with the stories and stuff of why they're there. And so you see, especially in the beginning episodes, them kind of struggling to take over. You can watch something for so long, but then when you finally do it, you find out it's not necessarily as easy as you thought. So one of the things that we get within this episode is we get a number of people claiming basically Colorado's just filled with grizzly bears. That's what attacked the hikers. It's attacked previous hikers. There's a guy who has been hunting grizzlies in Colorado for all of his life. That's not a thing. Grizzlies aren't native to the area. I mean, maybe some zoos somewhere, but yeah, grizzlies aren't around. We also see Sam and Dean talking to a ranger and saying that they're from UC Boulder, which is not the name of the school. This one I like to chalk up to Sam and Dean working out their alibis and everything.
Yeah.
If you're not from the area and you're just traveling, just on the fly, you're like, oh, what am I doing up here? Trying to make something up. So they misquoted the name of the school, which I think is a bit of a character choice. And then you see throughout there they do a little bit more research on where they are and everything to make their stories a little bit more believable.
Alibis become a little bit more airtight.
Yeah. They find out that there was a gal that was looking for a hiker who she had reported missing, but he wasn't supposed to be back for a couple of days based on his camping permit. And so the ranger just assumed that they were up there for her. So Dean gets a copy of the camping permit to find out where she's at, so that way they can go talk to her to see, what might be going on, because they don't know why they're here. They just got the coordinates from their father. Here we get to see one of our next inaccuracies as they go to talk to Haley, and right when she opens the door, Dean introduces himself as Dean, and this is Sam, and he says that they're from the Ranger Service and they're there to talk to her about, the missing person. She asks to see some ID, so he pulls out his fake ID and puts it up to the screen, and the camera zooms in on it, and you can see that his name on his ID says that his name is actually Samuel Cole. So again, this is just a bit of him not pre-thinking, the fake IDs and all that.
I mean, she doesn't catch it, so...
Yeah.
Or does she? She doesn't catch it.
She doesn't catch it, no. While Sam and Dean are talking to Haley, we get introduced to Ben, who is played by a young Alden Ehrenreich. It was his first role before he grew up to become a young Han Solo.
Basically, so he's getting hunted by a very skinny Jabba in this episode.
Could be. Sam and Dean find out that their brother Tommy had gone missing. Even though he wasn't set to be back, he had been checking in every day, and they knew that something was amiss. Sam and Dean go to look into it a little bit more, and they find out that hikers had regularly gone missing in this area, and Sam points out that it happens every 23 years like clockwork, so we got some kind of backwoods Pennywise going on or something.
Yeah.
While they're doing their research, they did find an article of a kid that actually survived this grizzly attack, because that's what all the authorities are chalking it up to, and they decide to go talk to this kid to see what he has to say. This is something that I found extremely interesting. They go and they find this kid who has grown up. He's an old man now. His name's Shaw, and Shaw was played by Donnelly Rhodes, who, I mean, when you think about it, they're in one location. They're, for the show, they have to get extras, and it have to be different people every episode. Well, after a while, you start to run out of extras because you can only, there's only so many extras out there.
Yeah.
So Shaw is this kid all grown up, and later, about 8 years later, he gets himself kind of cleaned up a little bit and returns as Father Simon, who was a priest that helped to do research on how to cure demons for the Men of Letters.
Huh. Yeah, did not catch that.
Yeah. Well, and you'll find throughout Supernatural there's actually a lot of kind of the background characters that will show up in more than one episode. So I'm kind of interested to keep looking out for those that come back but not as the same character.
Yeah.
Here they find out that when his family was attacked, they weren't camping in a tent, they were actually in a cabin, and Shaw states that it didn't break a window or break down the door, it unlocked the door. So less of a grizzly potentially. So at this point, Dean had mentioned that he thinks that it could be a skinwalker or a black dog. Probably less of the black dog if it's unlocking doors, but they're still unsure as to what they're hunting. We get a little bit of family drama here as Dean is interested in figuring out what's going on so he can help these people with whatever they're being plagued by. Sam just wants to find his dad. He's very solely motivated right now because he feels once he finds his dad, they can work together to find the thing that killed his girlfriend, and they can kill that. He doesn't seem to care right now, which is, again, a little bit out of character for Sam normally, but he did have a little bit of trauma recently, so Sam and Dean decide to go out and help because Haley had mentioned that they had hired a hunter to help them track down where their brother might have been and to find him. So they meet up with Haley, Ben, and Roy to kind of help them with whatever it is that they're going to have to deal with. There's a little bit of tension between Roy and Dean as, they're both kind of the macho type, and
Alpha male in the same room.
You have that little bit of a twist there where Roy looks like he's about to threaten Dean. Dean's kind of like, what are you doing there, Roy? And then Roy reveals, he's about to step in a bear trap, so kind of like knocks Dean back a little bit. At this point, Haley's starting to suspect that they're not really rangers, as Dean's out there hiking in jeans and biker boots, and she gives him a hard time for not bringing any provisions, which he is like, what are you talking about? I brought provisions, and he brings up some peanut M&Ms, which will come into play later. Those are very important. They find the campsite of their brother, and then we start to get a little bit more of an idea on what they're hunting as we hear their brother yelling for help off in the distance. Sam and Dean are like, nope, that's not your brother, that's something else. It's at this point, Sam kind of pulls Dean aside and asks for their father's journal, which he looks through to point out that he's pretty sure that they're hunting a Wendigo. Dean mentions that they're normally found more in around like the Minnesota, Michigan area, and he's never heard of one this far out west. So, we'll get to that a little bit later to see if that matches up. Using some Anasazi symbols, they set up a protective circle that apparently the Wendigo can't enter, and they decide to camp there for the night. At one point throughout the night, they start hearing cries for help again, and the Wendigo starts running circles around their camp. Roy takes a shot at it and decides that he hit it, so he's going to take off after it to make sure that it's dead. And this is where we say goodbye to Roy, as it drops down from a tree and snaps his neck. At this point, Sam and Dean decide to let Ben and Haley in a little bit more on what's going on, and so they give them a backstory on what the Wendigo is, where it's created by a human who has resorted to cannibalism, and that's kind of what starts the path to Wendigoism. I don't know.
Yeah.
And that guns and knives are pretty much useless, and basically kill it with fire. That's the rule for Wendigos in this episode. The next day, the group goes in search of trying to see if their brother might still be alive, because the Wendigo will string up some of the people that it catches to feed on whenever it wants. They get led into a trap set by the Wendigo, as he was using distinct markings to lure them into an area so he could drop Roy in on them. From here, we now lose both Haley and Dean as they just kind of disappear. However, Dean left a trail of M&Ms that can be followed to where they're at. Sam and Ben follow the trail to an abandoned mine where they find Dean, Haley, Tommy, their brother, and flare guns. Because why not? Well, one thing
Supernatural cheating.
One thing I did leave out earlier is when they found the campsite and the Wendigo yelled for help, they went running, and then when they came back to the campsite, all of their gear had been stolen. So it was luring them away in order to take away their communications and weapons and stuff like that. So
Flare guns were basically left by them or either Roy or other travelers.
Right. So it's kind of stockpiling things from the people that it's been kidnapping.
It's the ugliest magpie you've ever seen.
Here, Dean decides to play the role of bait so Sam can get everybody out of the mine, which, by the way, he is terrible bait, because he goes running off with the flare gun yelling for the Wendigo to come and get him and all this, and it doesn't. It goes after Sam and the rest of the people. Sam uses his flare and attempts to shoot the Wendigo, but it moves at incredible speeds and was able to dodge the flare, and so he misses. Sam's now in more of his stereotypical protector role as he's standing in front of everybody, and then Dean shows up out of nowhere again.
He's trying to get supernatural powers.
Right. And Dean is now able to shoot the slow-moving Wendigo that doesn't bother to try to get out of the way of his flare. Now that the Wendigo's been taken care of, everybody gets back into town, and you know what? They blame it on the Grizzlies, because why not?
It'll be a lot more believable.
And then Dean kind of calls Sam out on his uncharacteristicness, and like, look, you need to cut your crap. And Sam's like, no, I'm fine, and Sam's fine, except when he's not. So it's kind of setting up this lingering guilt of Sam's, where he'd basically gotten his girlfriend killed, and he wants to avenge her. And this is actually the episode where we first hear the line of saving people, hunting things, the family business. And so basically what it comes down to is he wants to avenge his girlfriend, but in the meantime, as quoted by Sam and Dean throughout the episode, they're just gonna kill as many evil sons of bitches as they can. And so that's where we end with our second episode. So, I mean, how accurate are we talking here as far as the Wendigo goes?
Pretty dang accurate.
Oh, good.
What I do like is that they bring up that they've never seen one this far west or this one far south, because the Wendigo... Now, so the Wendigo episode, I watched the first episode when it originally came out, and I enjoyed it.
Mm.
The second episode, though, is what got me hooked, because Supernatural does a very, very good job I'm not a big urban legend fan. I do enjoy them, but they're not my bread and butter.
Sure.
What I really love is I love folk tales and I love mythology. And Supernatural is very, very good at retelling mythological stories in a twisty way or in a way that makes more sense towards our modern times.
Sure.
So the regular Wendigo was a mythological creature from the Canadian border up through the northeast area of the United States, mostly part of the Aquopian people.
Okay.
They weren't necessarily one tribe. They were kind of a culturally diverse group of people that spread out all through there. The Wendigo was one of the common denominators between them, is that they all seem to have a cannibalism story. And considering how cold and most of the food that you can get up there, you can't really get unless you have something called a rifle, or at least like a bow and arrow. Especially during the winter, cannibalism, starvation could be something that that you would be very frightened of. There were two different types of Wendigo. There was the Wendigo that we see in the show, where it is this gaunt, giant creature. Its face, the skin seemed to just stick to its face, and the bones showing through. There was also some qualities of the Wendigo was that every time it would eat in proportion to what it would grow in proportion to what it was eating, so it never would be full.
Right.
A Wendigo is often a human that has turned to cannibalism and now only craves human flesh. It was frequently thought that they were also greedy individuals as well. They weren't simply cannibals. So the Wendigo became kind of that boogeyman creature. There's also the second type of Wendigo, which was come to be known later as Wendigo psychosis, which is a craving for human flesh. The spirit of the Wendigo would possess a greedy individual, or perhaps an immoral individual, or an individual that had to resort to cannibalism. And so now they would crave human flesh consistently and incessantly. The Wendigo psychosis actually recorded in what was called the Jesuit Relations, as a group of French Jesuits were coming through that portion of Canada. They were scheduled to meet with a group of men. The group of men would then unfortunately undergo a great deal of starvation, and as they went to go meet them, they actually reported seeing Wendigo psychosis actually happening as they were pouncing upon men and women and children and devouring their flesh. Now, how much of this can be believed and how much of it was actually them trying to push the dangers of the new world that they were in as they were trying to spread Catholicism is up for debate. But Wendigo psychosis has been recorded as more of a cultural phenomenon, as it's not something that we necessarily see in other cultures, but it's a culture that believes so fiercely in the Wendigo, in the evils of cannibalism, that individuals that might suddenly resort to cannibalism or have a little bit of a mental break suddenly think that they are now Wendigo and start taking on the traits of the Wendigo. Now, as for the Wendigo that we see in Supernatural, with its weakness being to fire, that is very accurate as well, in that the more supernatural monster version of the Wendigo is thought to have a heart made out of ice. And that the only way that you can fully kill the Wendigo is to melt that heart made of ice in order to cause it to die. Up until that point, they can be killed just like any other man. So if Dean and Sam had actually just pulled their guns out, or were able to get to their guns and shot it and then burned the body, in theory that could have also worked. There is a story of a great warrior coming through a tribe hunting for Wendigos, and he ends up coming across an entire Wendigo family. But they're not really the massively gaunt and monstrous creature that we hear described in later mythologies, but instead they look like regular people going about their day-to-day lives until the craving strikes them, and then they pounce on an unsuspecting person and then kidnap them and murder them and eat them.
Almost like a were-Wendigo.
A were-Wendigo. Yeah, it only happens at like a certain point. He goes and he tracks his family down until he's absolutely sure that all of them are Wendigos, that they are cannibals, it's at this point that the hunter also happens to be graced with a supernatural ability and is able to disguise himself as an old man to trick the Wendigos. Has supernatural strength and speed, and so is able to actually kill all of the Wendigo family single-handedly, as well as several of the servants that they might have with them. And then after killing them, burned the bodies, but their hearts were so cold that it required a great deal amount of flame in order to get the hearts to melt. So I don't know that necessarily a flare gun would have been the thing to take out the Wendigo in this story, but I love the creativity behind it. That it's just, okay, we need fire to be able to kill it. Well, we don't have fire right now. We have a flare gun. Okay, and then boom, and that's all it takes to set a Wendigo off and set it on fire. However, the human flesh does not necessarily ignite at the human flesh does not really ignite at the temperature that you're going to get with a flare. You're probably going to get some very severe burns. So you have to take a little bit of creative license and think that also the Wendigo at this point is now just so cold and so icy and basically dead that it's now basically a walking corpse in a sense.
Now, they did encounter it in a mine that warned them to stay out because of toxic material. Maybe there was some flammable stuff that was in that mine that, with just the Wendigo living in there, it kind of had coated itself with this flammable material.
That works just as well too.
Supernatural cheating.
Yes. Supernatural cheating. That being said, this was the episode that really got me hooked into Supernatural as a TV show. Was this mythological creature and how it would exist now in modern days. And I'm very curious, I know we're never going to actually know, but was this Wendigo, was it like a creation of another monster, or was this some poor person that got lost somewhere in the woods of Colorado and had to resort to eating his fellows, and now we have a Wendigo that can wander through the West?
Can it happen anywhere?
Can it happen anywhere? Is a Wendigo specifically a cultural thing, or did the Ocultrians just make a much better job of keeping track of the Wendigo? I would love to see the Wendigo make a return in a future episode of Supernatural. Whether or not we're going to get that is very, very small, but I loved this creature.
One of the things I also liked throughout the episode is it going back and looking at these earlier ones, we get a lot of the less is more look.
I love the less is more look.
Where, watching through it the first time, I just took it at face value. It was what it was. Going back and watching it, having seen everything up to date, it made the episode a lot more of like the horror movie type thing. Where, you don't know what it is that's after them. You get like the brief glimpses, and, your imagination is always going to do a better job than what effects can be done in whatever production of whatever you're watching.
And even when you get a full view of the Wendigo, it's done in darkness, it's done in the mine, and so you can see the things that they talk about. You can see the skin that's pulled taut against the bone. You can see the kind of inhuman looking features, but you don't really get to see them. You see them, but it's all in darkness, and so your imagination kind of takes over for some of the rest of it. It's what made Jaws so successful initially, is you don't exactly know what you're dealing with. And then when they finally do a big reveal with it, it's more right around when it's dying.
Yeah.
When you can see the flare start to light it up, the fire starts to light it up, and it collapses to the ground on fire. It's like, then that's when you really get a good view of it, but by then it's no longer a threat. Yeah, the Wendigo episode, I love rewatching that one.
It's definitely a fun one.
Oh, absolutely. I think, too, those, for me, as what, my own personal relationship with Supernatural is anytime we get a creature feature, any creature feature episode, if it goes away from the haunting, it goes away from angels and demons, things like that, and we get a creature, those are my favorites. I don't care what season we're in. Those are my favorite episodes.
I also like, which I'm sure the reasoning for this was more to budget than anything else, but how all of their creatures are humanized. Whereas they're not like later when we're introduced into werewolves, they're not actually turning into a wolf. They just get like the claws and the fangs,
Yep.
and that's it.
Well, there's certain aspects of like the Wendigo. It's supposed to be very humanoid-esque,
Sure.
but there are also versions of it where they have like large stag antlers or horns or other things that you can find out in, especially the very, very north. But they just stuck with the very decrepit human creature.
Now, in the episode of Supernatural, it's just stated that it moves really, really fast. I want to say I've heard somewhere that they're also in some areas supposed to be able to teleport, aren't they?
They are. It really depends on the folklore that you're looking at. The one folktale that I was talking about, it makes me think that they are supposed to move supernaturally fast, because it is talked about the hero of that, I believe his name was Umwe. Umwe was able to move supernaturally fast as well. He was able. He had super strength, super speed. He was able to disguise himself so he has some element of a supernatural ability, and it's probably how he was able to keep up with the Wendigos.
Okay.
And then, were Wendigos a real life thing? Wendigo psychosis. That one is still up for debate amongst the medical communities, but we even see examples of people who believed that they were helping euthanize Wendigos, that if people felt like there was a craving happening, there was an example of a doctor who believed that he could help them by euthanizing them, so he would strangle them to death in order to stop them from murdering people and consuming their flesh and becoming full-fledged Wendigos.
Oh, well, I mean, it solved that problem, I guess.
One problem for another problem.
Yeah.
So yes, the Wendigo definitely falls a little bit more in line with what we see mythologically.
Interesting, like the way you described the Wendigo psychosis almost reminds me of more of like a Rougarou.
A Rougarou? A bit.
At least the way it's presented in a future episode of Supernatural.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that kind of comes into a lot of the mythology, a lot of the folklore were about things that scare us. And being made someone's meal is not something that people really want, and it's a very taboo thing. You don't, we look at the Donner Party with disgust, when a lot of them were just doing what they had to do to survive, and they weren't actively murdering people. People were just dying, and then they consumed them. Or we look at the story of Alfred Packer, and Alfred Packer for a long period of time was viewed as almost this boogeyman kind of a person, until archaeological studies would come up and corroborate his story, which was that he killed, that all of his party members were killed by one individual, and then he killed that individual in self-defense, and out of desperation ate them. But it was still a very taboo thing to do, and so things like Rougarous and Wendigos are going to share a similar trait because of the taboo of cannibalism.
Side note, doesn't the museum here in town have an Alfred Packard,
They do.
spot?
The Museum of Western Colorado, which is where we are, which we all live around, was one of the groups that actually helped corroborate Packard's story. So yeah, we're pretty familiar with that one here.
Plenty of Wendigos and Grizzlies up in this area.
So that was the story of the Wendigo, and that checks off another episode on our box.
All right, well, tune in next time as we move on to our third episode and our Supernatural rewatch. And until then, stay safe and buckle up.
We got work to do.